Old Celtic Tales by E M Wilmot-Buxton, The Lady of the Fountain. Part 3. The Further Adventures of Owain. When 3 long years had gone by, King Arthur began to get very sad because he heard nothing of his good knight Owain. And when the others saw his sadness, they suggested that he and the men of his household should go and seek Owain. So they set off, and Kynon was their guide. They spent the night at the castle of the man in yellow, and he and his 24 damsels waited upon them with the utmost hospitality. In the morning they set off for the wood, and passing the black man, they came to the fountain. Then Sir Kai begged that he might throw the water on the slab and receive the adventure that first befell. All happened as before, save that several of the attendants were killed by the hailstorm, and as they stood listening to the song of the birds, a knight clad in black satin, riding on a coal-black horse, spurred up to Sir Kai, and in a few minutes Sir Kai was overthrown. Then the knight rode off, and the host of Arthur encamped as darkness drew on. The next day Sir Kai met the Black Knight again, and this time was wounded very sorely. Then each of the knights in turn fought, and all were overthrown save one, and he was called Gwalchmai. The fight between him and the Black Knight was very fierce, but at length a heavy blow broke the helmet of Gwalchmai and showed his face. And behold, the Black Knight threw down his sword and embraced him, saying, "Little did I know that you were my cousin Gwalchmai." Then did Gwalchmai know the voice of Owain, and embraced him, and brought him to Arthur, and everyone was glad to see the long-lost knight again. So all the company proceeded to the castle of the Countess of the Fountain, and there partook of a great banquet, which had been 3 years preparing, for Owain had always said that Arthur would come to seek him. And when all was over, Arthur prepared to depart, but first he sent a message to the Countess, begging her to permit Owain to go and visit him for the space of 3 months. So Owain departed, though much against the will of his Countess, and when he was once more among his kindred and friends, he forgot all about his wife and the people in yellow, and stayed away 3 years instead of 3 months. At the end of these 3 years, as Owain sat one day at meat in the royal city of Caerleon on Usk, there rode through the doorway of the hall a damsel on a bay horse covered with foam, wearing a bridle and saddle of gold, and the damsel was clad in a robe of yellow satin. She came up to Owain, and taking the ring from off his hand, "Thus," she said, "shall be treated the deceiver, the traitor Coll, the faithless and the disgraced." Then she turned her horse's head and rode away. Then was Owain deeply ashamed and sorrowful, and on the next day he left the court, and wandered to the distant parts of the country and to waste places and barren mountains. And he stayed there until his clothes were worn out and his body wasted away and his hair grown long. His only companions were the wild beasts with whom he fed, and they grew to love him as their friend. But after a time he became so weak that he could no longer abide with them. So he descended from the mountains into the fairest park in all the world, which was said to belong to a widowed countess. One day the countess and her maidens were walking by a lake that was in the middle of the park, when they saw in the pathway the prostrate figure of a man. At first they thought he was dead, but they went near and touched him, and found there was life in him, though he was very much exhausted. So the countess returned to the castle, and sent one of her maidens with a flask full of precious balsam to the sick man, together with a horse and a good suit of clothes, and said, "Go with these, and place them near the man we saw just now. Anoint him with the balsam near his heart, and if there is still life in him, he will arise through the strength of the balsam. Then watch what he will do." The maiden departed, and forthwith poured the whole of the balsam on Owain, and left the horse and the garments close by, and hid herself, and watched what would happen. Presently he began to move his hands, then his arms, and then all at once he rose up, and was ashamed to see how ragged and dirty he looked. Then he perceived the horse and the garments, so he washed in the lake and crept to the horse, and with difficulty clothed himself, and clambered onto the saddle. Then came the maiden from her hiding place, and he was rejoiced to see her, and asked her to whom the park belonged. "Truly," said she, "a widowed countess owns park and castle, which are all that are left to her of 2 noble earldoms left to her by her late husband, All the rest has been taken from her by a neighboring earl because she refused to become his wife." "That is a pity," said Owain. And the maiden conducted him to the castle, and brought him to a pleasant room, and left him there. Then she went to the countess, and gave her back the flask. "Ha, damsel," said her mistress, "where is all the balsam?" "Have I not used it all?" said she. "O maiden," said the countess, "thou hast wasted for me 70 pounds worth of ointment on an unknown stranger. However, now that he is here, wait thou upon him until he is quite recovered." So the maiden tended Owain, and gave him meat and drink and medicine until he was well again. And in 3 months he was as comely a knight as ever he had been before. One day he heard a great tumult in the castle, and asked the maiden the cause thereof. She told him that the earl whom she had mentioned before had come against the countess with a large army to force her to marry him. "Has she a horse and arms to spare?" asked Owain. "She has the best in the world," said she. "Then go and beg the loan of them," said Owain, "that I may go and have a look at this earl." "I will," said the maiden. So she made her request to the countess. But the lady laughed a bitter laugh, and said, "He may as well have them today as my enemy tomorrow, but I know not what he would do with them." Then they brought out a beautiful black horse, with a beechen saddle, and a suit of armor for man and horse, and Owain armed himself and rode forth, attended by 2 pages. When they came in sight of the enemy, they could not see where the army ended, it was so great, but Owain asked where the earl himself was, and when he was pointed out, he sent the pages back to the castle, and rode forward till he met the earl. And Owain was now so strong that he drew the earl completely out of the saddle, and turned his horse's head towards the castle, and, although it was no easy task, brought the earl to the gate. When they had entered, he gave the earl as a gift to the countess, and said to her, "Lo, here is a return to you for your wondrous balsam." Then the earl restored to the countess her 2 earldoms in ransom for his life, and for his freedom he gave her half his own domains, and all his jewels and gold and silver. After this, Owain departed from the castle, though all honored him greatly and begged him to stay with them. But he was still ashamed and sorrowful at heart, and preferred rather to ride forth into desert places again. One day, as he was journeying through a wood, he heard a great uproar, and riding forward found a great craggy mound, on the side of which was a grey rock. In the rock was a cleft, and in the cleft a serpent, and nearby stood a black lion, and every time the lion moved to go, hence the serpent darted towards him to attack him. Then Owain unsheathed his sword, and struck the serpent, and cut him in 2, and went on his way. But, strange to say, the lion followed him, and played about him like a dog. All that day they travelled together, and at night Owain dismounted, and turned his horse loose in a woody meadow, and he kindled a fire, the lion bringing him wood enough to last for 3 nights. Then the lion disappeared, and after a while returned bearing a fine, large roebuck, which he laid before Owain. And when it was skinned and roasted, it made an excellent supper for them both. As he was eating, he heard a deep sigh near him, which was repeated 3 times. "Who is there?" asked Owain. "A mortal maiden," was the reply. "Who art thou?" he asked again. And the voice replied, "I am Luned, the handmaiden of the Countess of the Fountain. In this stone vault am I imprisoned on account of the knight who came from Arthur's court and married my countess. For a short time only he stayed with her, and then went away, and has never returned, and he was the friend I loved most in the world. And one day 2 of the pages of the countess's chamber reviled him, and called him ill names, and I told them that they 2 were not a match for him alone. Then they imprisoned me in this stone cell, and said I should be put to death unless he came himself to deliver me by a certain day, and that is the day after tomorrow. But I have no one to send to seek him for me, and his name is Owain, the son of Urien." Then Owain said, "Art thou certain that if the knight knew all this, he would come to your rescue?" "I am most certain of it," said she. So Owain bade her hope for the best, and Mentime bade her tell him if there were any place near where he could get lodging for the night. She bade him follow the river, so he rode along till he came to a very fine castle. The earl who ruled over the place received him very hospitably, and good fodder was given to his horse. But the lion went and lay down in the horse's manger, so that none of the men of the castle dared to approach him. Meantime, Owain had been brought in to supper, and very soon the lion came and sat between his knees and shared his food. Then Owain noticed that everyone in the castle was very sorrowful. The earl sat on one side of him, and his fair young daughter on the other, and he never saw anyone look as sad as they. In the middle of supper the earl began to bid Owain welcome, adding, "Heaven knows it is not thy coming which makes us sorrowful, but we have good cause for care." "How is that?" asked Owain. "I have 2 sons," replied the earl, "who went yesterday to hunt upon the mountains. But on the mountains lives an evil monster who kills men and devours them, and he has seized my sons, and tomorrow he will bring them here and will devour them before my eyes, unless I will deliver my sweet daughter into his hands. He has the form of a man but the strength of a giant, and no one can do aught against him." "Truly this is a hard case," said Owain. "And what wilt thou do?" "Heaven knows," said the earl, "but I can never give up my young daughter to be destroyed by him, yet I cannot bear to lose my 2 brave sons." So no more was said, and Owain stayed there that night. Next morning a great noise was heard as the giant entered the courtyard, dragging behind him the 2 youths by the hair of their heads. Then Owain put on his armor and went out to fight the giant, and the lion followed him. The giant made a great rush upon the knight, and the lion fought on Owain's side, more fiercely than his master. At length the giant said, "I could easily settle this business with you, were it not for the animal that is with you." So Owain shut the lion up inside the castle walls and went back to fight the giant as before. But the lion heard that it was going ill with Owain, and he roared very loud and climbed up till he reached the top of the castle, and then sprang down from the walls and joined his master. And very soon he gave the giant such a stroke with his paw that the monster fell down dead. Then the earl was full of gratitude and begged Owain to remain with him, but he would only stay 1 more night, and on the morrow set out for the meadow where Lund was imprisoned in the mound. When he reached the spot, he found a great fire kindled, and 2 youths with curling auburn hair were leading the maiden forth to cast her in the fire. "Why are you treating her thus?" asked Owain. They told him of the compact that was between them concerning the maiden. "Owain has failed her," said they. "Therefore she must be burnt according to our agreement." "Well," said Owain, "I know him for a good knight, and if he had known of the maiden's peril, he would have come to her rescue. But if you will accept me in his stead, I will do battle for her." This was agreed, and the fight began. But the 2 were together stronger than Owain, and he was hard beset. Then the lion came to his help, and they too were stronger than the young men. So they said to him, "Chieftain, we did not agree to fight with thy lion, but only with thee." Then Owain shut the lion up in the stone vault where the maiden had been imprisoned, and blocked up the entrance with stones, and returned to the fight. But he was weak from loss of blood, and the young men pressed hard upon him, and the lion roared like thunder when he heard that his master was in trouble, and he burst through the wall and rushed upon the young men and slew them both. So Luned was saved, and glad was she when she found it was Owain indeed who had come to her rescue. Together they sought the dominions of the Countess of the Fountain, and she and Owain and the lion and Luned lived all happily together for the rest of their lives.
The Ultimate Question is a fully dramatized, award-winning fantasy story, available free for a limited time wherever you listen to audiobooks or podcasts. Please find all the links by visiting uqstory.com.
That's the end of the story for now. Please like, share, follow, and subscribe to be sure not to miss future stories. Please also consider visiting SchaeferMediaEnterprises.com to support this free service. Thanks.